Hi there. So this is a tutorial on how to test Axios inside of React using functional components. We're using TypeScript and the React testing library. We're essentially using Axios to fetch data to render these fish that you see on the screen. And we're triggering it by clicking a button, as you see there. And we also have a little spin animation, because why not? But let's first look at the component itself. So we got our app. This is our whole app. We have a div and our custom practice component right here with no child props. If you have child props, I have some examples for that, but otherwise not. Here's that. And then of course you want to get more specific. Here's the rest of our app here, but I didn't touch anything. All this is pretty much just the base, what you get when you create one. So let's control click to get inside of this bad boy. And here's our prop that's not being used. Still there, but not used. Otherwise, we've got these three use states, which are used for when we're loading the data, when we're receiving the data, or the data itself. It's not receiving, it's the data itself, or an error, if an error has occurred. And this is the function that's triggered upon clicking our button right here. And you'll notice we're doing an axios.get. I'll also show you how to test if you're just using an Axios call without a .get or .post or .put or what have you. It's very similar, very, very simple to do. This is, of course, our toggle spin thing. But this is all the HTML we've got, really. We've got a button, is loading text, which is conditionally rendered, as you see here. So only if it's loading, it'll show loading. If there's an error, it'll show this error in red text. Otherwise, we have our data itself. These are the fish that spin around if you want. And there's the images themselves. And you'll notice all of these have a test ID. Well, not all, actually. The button doesn't have one, but everything else has a test ID just to make things a little bit easier for the test. But yeah, speaking of, let's get to it. So here's the test. This is the test itself. I would start off by importing Axios for sure, and then mocking that bad boy with a string. I like to start off with the describe to encapsulate all of your tests. And I also have 3 different steps before we even get to the tests. First step, declaring your prop variables, or random other variables that are not props necessarily, but you might be using for your test. In this case, we really don't have that many. We have a fake prop. Here, step 2, we have the before each, where we're clearing all the mocks to start with. You can also do this in an after each. I just like doing them before. But key thing here is we're initializing the props. And we're also doing this just fn to further mock, let's say, the specific method that we're using. So we're doing the .get, mocking that guy. I mean, since this applies to all the tests, we put it in the before each, because this before each will run before every single test. And step 3 is rendering the component itself, which you definitely don't have to do in a function. I just prefer to use a function myself. And the key thing here is, the render function from testing library, importing that bad boy. And yes, finally, the tests themselves. So yeah, here's the test itself. We'll start with the successful one. So first things first, I like to mock Axios in this case, the thing that we're mocking. And we're doing axios.get mock resolved value. So this is if it resolves, it's successful. It didn't have any errors. It's working out. And I'll have it start off with an object that has data. That's the key thing, is an object with data property. And everything after this data property, whatever comes after, super duper depends on whatever data you're getting. It's totally up in the air. I have no idea what your data might be, but in my case, it happens to be in this format where I have another object inside of that called sprites, and then inside of that we have a specific sprite, the front default sprite. And that is what this guy is, this little image. So that's the data being mocked, and then followed by that we render the component doing the setup RTL function. And this will return, I honestly returns a lot of things. So we're deconstructing what its return value to these grabber functions, these functions that look for things on the page. So what this is doing is rendering, right? It's rendering the component, and these bad boys are really important because they look at the things you're rendering, this stuff, looking at all this stuff and are saying, let's get that element. If you're familiar with JavaScript, then there's document.getElement by ID. You know, that's a pretty commonly used function. This is a similar thing to that, but in a testing scenario. So in this case, this test ID that this function will grab is this data-test ID. Not sure why test and ID are squished together like that, but what can you do? And then get by text, which just simply looks for an element based on the text it sees rendered on the page, which in my buttons case is fetch those fish. So finally we get to the actual testing of things. First things first, we're getting that fish button with get by text, and we're clicking it. We're doing .click. Now you can also do fire event .click. That's another option. You definitely do have that, but we're not using that in this case. Just another option. And followed by that, we have the expect, just classic. If you're more familiar with backend tests, you might be familiar with the assert function. Expect is pretty much the same thing, just for front end, where we're just expecting some element, and then we're expecting what? In this case, we're adding the dot to be in the document function. So we're just checking to see, in plain English, is this loading div or loading element on the page in the document after we click this button? So step 1, click button. Step 2, is it in the document? So we're specifically looking for this guy. And honestly, I could have done get by text loading, would have been fine, but I decided, what if it's like a loading spinner or something? We'll do a data test ID. Make that a lot easier for ourselves. And after that, we're going to check to see is axios.get is the getting function, right, of the data, is that being called after we click the button? And assuming it has been called, it must also surely have been mocked, because we mocked it beforehand, before it was even rendered, which must mean if it's getting data, this totally fake data right here, then it must be rendering a fish on the page. And this test ID, image 0, represents the first fish being rendered. If I go back to the actual HTML, you'll notice this data test ID starts off with img, since it is an image, followed by the index of basically the order that the data is coming in from the API, which of course, as you may know, first element in any array is going to be 0. So in this case, it'll be image 0 for the first fishy. And just like the loading document, or the loading element, we're checking to see, is this first fish in the document? And that's it. That's how we're testing all those things. Yeah, so that's the successful test. Moving on, we have our unsuccessful test, where, again, we're mocking to start. First thing we're mocking is console.error, using the same just fn to mock this function, where right here, you'll see if we get inside of this catch, if we trigger an error, we should get inside this catch function right here. And one of the things inside of that is this console.error, which should print a little error message down here. And yeah, this just makes sure that we can see that in our expect, which we have on this line. And second thing, we have axios.get again, but this time it's mock rejected value. And frankly, I think in here, you don't have to put new error. You can put data if you want. It would make more sense probably to put, status 400, because HTTP's 400 code is pretty common error. Maybe 404 is more common, but yeah. I just stick with new error, why not? Then we're rendering the component, where we have only one new grabber function, and that's query by test ID. And the difference with query test ID is it allows us to test if something is not in the document, because get by test ID is really picky. It always wants the thing you're looking for to be in there, and if it's not, it's pissed. It's gonna be upset, and your test is not gonna pass. And we don't want that, of course. So that's what those bad boys do. So now let's start by the test itself, where we have our get by text, fetch those fish. So we're clicking the same exact button as we were before. And this time, as I showed you earlier, we have this expect console.error to have been called instead of axios. I really could have done axios.get in here if I wanted, but I decided against it. I'm like, yeah. Why do that? So we have that. And if that's being called, if this is being called, then we've gotten in here. We've already gotten in here, which means this must be set to true, which means logically, surely, this should be showing on the page. And that's what we'll be checking for. We'll be checking for that error Pokemon images. As you see here, error Pokemon images, data test ID. And yeah. Other than that, of course, we're just checking to see with that query by test ID, just to see, does this first fish image not show up in the document? If so, cool. That's what we're hoping for. And we do that with the dot not to be in the document. So yeah, I already kind of spoiled things here by running the test in the background, but if we do an npm run test, dying, damn. I apologize for sniffling so much, I'm so sick. At least I think I am. I think I'd just be allergies, honestly. Yeah, so here we go. We got these two guys here, and they both pass. Look at that. But what if you're not using a .get or .post, and you're instead using a just axios function, pure axios, and adding a comma, method property. You're still using get in our case, in our API's case, but again, it could be post, could be put, whatever you want. If we change that, then our test is most certainly going to fail, but not if we make a couple of changes. So really, if you do that, all you have to do is get rid of axios.get completely, and we're not even going to replace it. That's just, we don't need it anymore. For whatever reason, if you're mocking Axios itself up here, it's not required to add an Axios, for example, Axios equal jest function. I don't quite totally understand why that is, but it does not seem to require that. So we'll do that, and then we'll just simply get rid of any other instances of .get that you see anywhere else in this thing here. Oh yeah, right here, yeah. And let's save that guy before I forget. And run it. npm run. Yes. Will it pass though? That's a real question. I wonder here. Yay! Okay. So yeah, so this is how I prefer to test Axios calls. You can of course test the headers themselves. You can definitely get more in depth with your jest tests, but for a baseline, just testing Axios, is it being called? Is certain data being shown on the page afterwards or beforehand? This will hopefully help you figure out a way to do that. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful.